Okay. This morning there was a research session organized on initiative of you, Joan Tronto, and of the Ethics of Care group of the University of Humanistic Studies in Utrecht, the Netherlands. And the focus of this session was politics and policy that neglect dependency, vulnerability, derivative dependency of caregivers, and relational autonomy. Mm-hmm. The basis for this discussion was an essay of Susan Dutt entitled Dependence, Care and Vulnerability. Well, I have 3 questions for you. My first question is, could you shortly explain why you chose this essay for this research session and why it is helpful in thinking about care as political ethics?
All right, I shall. The essay comes from a volume called Vulnerability, and it's about feminist ethics. And the question that I wanted to pose to my student friends here at the UVH today was this question about how important still is feminism as part of the ethic of care. So Dodd's essay does not address this question so directly, but it gives you an exposure to the kind of analytical philosophy that's mostly done in the United States and English-speaking countries, and it raises some questions about what can feminism mean. So that's what I wanted to jump off from, and that's, I think, what I did.
Well, that's funny that your answer is also it. My second question is because that's also what you mentioned this morning, that the ethics of care is rooted in a feminist philosophy, but has now a more position of its own, the ethics of care. And what is your view when we look at the relationship between ethics of care and feminist philosophy today, anno 2015? How is that relationship?
Yeah, well, of course, feminism itself has changed over the last 2 generations, and it is no longer simply about securing rights for women that they don't have, or making certain that newspaper ads don't mention that only women can be secretaries or men truck drivers. I still think the ethics of care is basically rooted in a feminist perspective in some very important ways. Most importantly, perhaps, is that, to me, feminism has always been about being able to situate oneself, to think about what's natural or what we presume is natural, but also to situate ourselves and then to decenter ourselves from our social and political world. So it's so normal for people to think of themselves as the center of the world, but in fact it's also the case that if we start there, we will never learn much about others. However, if we only take the position of what we think are others or decenter ourselves that way, then we also miss the fact that we are still somewhere and we have to take into account our own position. So the complex positionalities of feminism, I think, are part and parcel of the good practice of the ethic of care.
Yeah. Well, I already come to my last question.
Okay.
You also mentioned just that one of important in the ethics of care is the context and the specific situation. And another important insight of the ethics of care is our practices for perceiving, understanding, and judging moral goods and thinking about good care. In this essay of Susan Dutt, there does not seem to be a lot of reference to real-life practice. And in that way, it may seem that the argument loses its empirical groundedness. What is your view on this matter?
Yeah, this is a style of writing philosophy which is a little different, and so it is not so grounded. But there are in the essay at least 2 parts that are very deeply grounded. One is the discussion of mental disability. And there she takes that example and talks about what it means to be a vulnerable person because of mental disability. And she makes a fairly elaborate argument about the different situations. It's not the end of the world, but it is an argument about this set of disabilities that make it easier to talk about vulnerability and dependence the way she wants to. Yeah? So there's that concrete example. The other thing she talks about in the essay that actually gets us to real practice, although she doesn't talk about it so much, is what she calls pathogenic vulnerabilities. That is, vulnerabilities that become a problem because of the way they are constructed in the world. And in general, I think the essay makes the point that's part of the larger volume, of which it's a part, that vulnerability is paradoxical. If we all recognize vulnerability, it's paradoxical in when we talk about ourselves as equally vulnerable. Well, okay, that's if a comet came to hit the Earth, we would all be vulnerable in the same way.
Yeah.
But on another level, we're not all vulnerable in the same way. And whichever you focus on, the moment you're focusing on one, you're missing the other. We go back to the point I made about positionality. You need to be able to do both at once, or to go from one to the other fairly quickly. And that, I think, is a really key, important thing that happens in this essay, that happens in what we need to understand about vulnerability, and which is at its root a very feminist understanding of the world.
I agree. So let's end this interview by that answer. And then I will hope to see you soon again in Holland. And I wish you luck with the next things you are doing. And we will meet again.
Okay, it's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.